Broadcasting from a tiny studio located somewhere in North America to the world. Waging war on the matrix of confusion.
Fires and light the fire.
I know one of them has is carrying a very large weapon.
I am really deeply worried. We have two grandchildren who are 6 and 8, and I believe they are in greater danger of dying from enemy activities than we were.
There's no reason, Bob, that young American soldiers need to be going into the homes of Iraqis in the dead of night.
The United States must secure its borders. This is a basic responsibility.
I doubt anyone here would recognize civic virtue if it reached up and bit you in the ass.
The hard part about playing chicken is knowing when to flinch.
Oh, girl, said with a smile, you don't have to love me.
And now, Dark Matters. Here's Don Ecker.
Try to understand. Try to understand. Them a man.
Ah, the right music to set the tone. Welcome to another edition of Dark Matters Radio, heard exclusively on Cyberstation USA. I am your host. My name is Don Ecker, and tonight we are truly taking an excursion into truly dark matters. Vampirism. Purportedly a real case out of the United Kingdom at a cemetery called Highgate in northern London. Now, I first heard about this case many, many years ago, back in the early 1980s, that purportedly surrounded the events of a genuine case of supernatural vampirism. Now, at the time, I couldn't really discover very much about it. Later, as I was to find out, there was an entire mythology built around this case of alleged vampirism. It wasn't until the early 1990s, after the internet really began to come into its own, that I was able to track down a lot of information about this purported case of real vampirism. But like I said, the roots go back to the early 1980s when I was a police officer, a criminal investigator, and I was investigating a case of cattle mutilation. Now, what really made that particular case so unusual was not only the mutilation marks that were on the animals, but also the fact that both cows were exsanguinated. In other words, they suffered a tremendous blood loss with absolutely no evidence to show where the blood went. It wasn't on the ground, it wasn't around. So, make a long story short, that case ultimately got shoveled under the rug. There wasn't much I could do about it, and it wasn't until some time later when I first heard about this alleged vampire case out of the United Kingdom. Now, like most everybody, over the years I've seen my share of horror films with a vampire theme. The original Dracula with Bela Lugosi. The Hammer films that came out of the UK's studios in London in the 50s and the 60s with Christopher Lee as Dracula. A lot of stuff like that. But of course, nobody ever really truly took it seriously, did they? In 1967 through about 1972 or 73, there was a case that received a lot of press attention and notoriety in the UK surrounding a cemetery that had first been established in early Victorian times, about 1839, in northern London. Now, this was the cemetery where if you were anybody who had died and was about to be buried, this is where you wanted to go. People like Michael Faraday, and even that icon of the communist system, Karl Marx, are all buried there in the Highgate Cemetery. And throughout the 19th century, the cream of London society ended up being interred there. As a matter of fact, Bram Stoker used Highgate in his seminal work, Dracula, although the identity of the cemetery itself was thinly disguised. But in the late 1960s, a couple of schoolgirls were passing, so the story went, when they were suddenly engulfed in psychic visions of the dead rising from the graves. Later, people began talking about a dark, supernatural type entity that was stalking the Highgate Cemetery. Soon the place was overrun with the public and the press, and that, of course, gave the Metropolitan Police all kinds of headaches, and the stories began to swirl. In about 1974, one guy by the name of David Farrant was arrested in the cemetery and accused of desecrating tombs. People were going throughout the cemetery and literally dragging corpses out and driving stakes through their chest because they thought there was a vampire there. Now, as wild as all this sounds, and of course it sounds pretty wild, for over 30, almost 40 years, there's been tremendous controversy about this case from basically two factions that were originally both involved in the Highgate investigation. One side was headed up by a guy by the name of Sean Manchester, who at the time was identifying himself as a paranormal researcher. On the other side was David Farrant, also another paranormal researcher. And a feud developed between these guys. Now, if it would have just simply been a feud between the two of them, that would have been fine. But it spilled over, literally all over the globe. And if you put those three terms in a search engine, the Highgate Vampire, Sean Manchester, David Farrant, you're going to find tons and tons of stuff out on the web about this feud, about that case, and claims and counterclaims that were made by all parties involved. Now, my involvement in the Highgate matter came about in the mid to latter 1990s. It was during this period of time when I had a friend who was then an editor with Cinescape magazine, and we exchanged publications. UFO magazine for a subscription with Cinescape. And because my wife and I live right here in the vicinity of quote-unquote the biz, Hollywood, we were interested in what was happening around us because a lot of times we reported on these types of activities in our publication, UFO magazine. And it was sometime in the mid to latter 1990s when I received an issue of Cinescape, and I saw a new film that was being produced by John Carpenter titled Vampires. Now, let me say this, that ever since I've been a small lad, I have just absolutely loved good horror. And this particular movie sounded like it was going to be very interesting. It was about a group of Vatican-sponsored vampire hunters. Of course, going on the premise that vampires were real, and only the Roman Catholic Church was really equipped to handle that supernatural threat. And it had several actors in it that I had a lot of regard for, one of them being James Woods. So I was excited to see this, and I told my wife that when this film was finally released, I wanted to be at the first viewing here in Burbank. Now, it just so happened that I was doing a little research on this particular movie, and I found out that it was a film that was being adapted from a novel of the same title by a fellow by the name of John Stakely, who came out of Texas and had written this book sometime back in either the late 80s or very early 90s. So I went out and bought a copy of it, and I got to tell you, I enjoyed it. But also being a writer and having a very, very deep regard for that horror genre, I thought that I could do an adequate job myself. And I began working on and researching material for my ultimately published novel Past Sins. Also a supernatural tale of supernatural vampirism. It was then that I remembered having heard about the Highgate case. So I started doing some cursory examination on the web, and I came across a lot of this material. Now, just the other day on Dark Matters, if you've been listening, you heard my interview with my very good friend John Spencer out of the UK. And back in those days, I contacted John and I asked him if it would be possible for him to make an introduction to some of these folks over there, because I was interested in interviewing them, possibly for a radio show or even an article. So he got in touch with the people affiliated with the Sean Manchester faction, who was regarded as the primary investigator on the Highgate case. He got back to me a week or so later and told me that they had no interest in speaking to me. Now, I found that rather unusual. It's not like my name as a researcher, writer, and commentator was completely unknown, and I wondered about that. But I figured, well, you know, not everybody gets lucky, and I moved on. It was later, when I was doing more research, and I actually incorporated several plot points from the Highgate case in my book, that I decided to do some more research. And being a former police officer, I wanted to find out what the real story was about the Highgate case. Now, as it turned out, I discovered that Manchester had written a purportedly true story book about the Highgate case. The book was titled The Highgate Vampire by Sean Manchester, and I searched here in the United States to see if I could secure a copy. Never did find it, and I ended up having to go through Amazon in the UK, but I did get that and another book that Manchester had written called The Vampire Hunter's Handbook. I ordered both those. As soon as they came, I dropped everything and I read them. And I got to tell you, I was somewhat taken aback by not only what he was stating in these books as being the absolute truth, but by what he was claiming about this so-called supernatural vampire. Now I was more interested and curious than ever. So I decided I was going to do as much of a criminal investigation on this case as I could from this side of the pond. Now, in his book, The Highgate Vampire, one of the things that Manchester claimed was that there was a victim of this vampire that ultimately died after being attacked by the vampire, and then she came back from the dead as a vampire herself. Now, this was, shall we say, just a little more than I could take, but I wanted to find out if there was any truth to this, who this supposed victim was and what her real name was. And in the book, Manchester never identified her. It was some time later when I was doing some more research concerning my own novel that I came across a podcast on the web here in the U.S. where these guys who had a supernaturally themed radio show had not only interviewed Sean Manchester, but also David Farrant. Well, I listened to both those episodes, and finally, my questions were answered. She was identified as one Jacqueline Cooper. Now, I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, because all of this is covered in the show you're about to hear. But just let me say that this was one of the more unusual cases that I had ever come across. Now, in complete openness, the interview I conducted with Mr. David Farrant took place a couple of years ago. But not many people have ever heard that show, and it is a very, very complete look at the entire Highgate case. So, with that being said, let's take a quick air break. And when we come back, my investigation into the Highgate Vampire right here on Cyberstation USA.